I was bored recently and decided I felt like watching something. Not for content or anything, but just for fun. I picked a show pretty much at random. That show ended up being Darwin's Game, a death game anime that got one season and looks like it won't get another since there's been no news about it for 2 years now. I watched the whole thing in a day and then I realized that I actually do want to talk about it. So here's the thing. Darwin's Game is not all that good. It's not exactly bad either, but there are pretty significant flaws that seriously drag it down on a writing level. But despite that, I actually had a really good time watching it, and if by some miracle it gets renewed for a second season, I will 100% be picking it up. So I want to talk about the issues the show has, but also what it does well, and specifically why I enjoyed myself despite its many issues. And also, it seems like I'm not alone in my enjoyment of Darwin's Game. A cursory look online shows that most of the people who watched it had a good time with it, so I want to explore that. But before I get into it, if at any point you think I'm doing a good job, please consider leaving a like and subscribing because it genuinely does help. Also, Twitter and Discord are down below, and consider joining Patreon for some nice bonuses like your name in videos and early access to future content. Alright, enough of that. So as you might imagine, this video will contain spoilers. I won't be spoiling every little thing, but I will be revealing certain major plot points. If that's something you'd rather avoid, I'll have a spoiler-free conclusion section at the end. Go to the timestamp on screen now if that's what you want. You have been warned. Also, I do want your feedback on this video, but I'll talk more about that at the end. Alright, let's get started. The basic premise of the show is that the titular Darwin's Game starts out as an innocuous-looking game on your phone. Though once you agree to play, you're locked into a free-for-all death game. The game itself has very video gamey elements such as awarding points for performance, which can be used on items such as flashbangs or grenades, a temporary safe zone, or can be redeemed for 100,000 yen or roughly $800 US each. It's worth noting that the points are given out fairly liberally, with the protagonist Kaname receiving 40 for winning his first battle. Everyone also receives a sigil which grants special powers. These can range from incredibly useful tools like invisibility to ones that are more useful outside of combat, such as a built-in lie detector. The main point of the game is that players can challenge each other to a fight, typically to the death. A winner is decided by one player killing the other, the timer running out, which usually results in a victory for the player who was challenged, or if one player surrenders. If the game is decided by the timer, the losing player is killed by the game. Players who surrender do not die unless the victor decides to kill them, though they do forfeit a portion of their accumulated points. So overall, pretty simple stuff. Death game with superpowers, and it's all integrated into a mobile game. And before I really get into the show, I am aware that Darwin's Game is an adaptation of the identically titled manga, which has had a similarly positive reception. I have not read it, though I do plan to in the near future. So this video will not be discussing Darwin's Game as an adaptation, but as a standalone product. So let's start out with the negatives. There are plenty of things you could nitpick about the series, but I'd rather hone in on what I feel are the 3 biggest persistent flaws. Weird pacing, poor use of an ensemble cast, and world building that I honestly found to be very frustrating. Now, I talk about pacing a lot in my videos because a lot of stories across all mediums suffer from pacing issues. It's just a difficult thing to get right, and even talented writers screw it up. Darwin's Game suffers from very jittery pacing where it kind of feels like it jumps between plot points. It never really feels like one connects to the next, and I feel like the season as a whole lacks a proper structure. And honestly, I feel like this was probably the result of the executives feeling like they know more than the creatives and telling them exactly how to do things. Which, by the way, is 100% the reason why the Muv-Luv alternative anime sucks. Let me back up a bit. Let's look at how the season is structured. Darwin's Game is comprised of 11 episodes that are the standard 22 minutes each, except for the first, which is an hour long. And story-wise, it seems to be going for a 3-act structure spanning the entire season. The first 2 episodes are essentially the introduction, or the first act. The first serves to introduce the game and pull Kaname into the mix. The bulk of the episode serves as a kind of scuffed training segment where Kaname has to learn the intricacies of the game on the fly and concludes with a fight against the highly accomplished Shuka. He uses quick thinking to overcome her, and after forcing her surrender, the two become allies. The second episode introduces the weak but highly intelligent Rain and mainly serves to set up the next big plot development. That's essentially the first act. The next 6 episodes are their own story arc. There's a big in-game event with 300 players competing for a big prize free-for-all style. This arc has its own mini 3-act structure as well. I'm not going to go into details, but there are 3 distinct phases there. The important thing is they set up the season's antagonist, Wang, a psychopath who leads the in-game clan known as the 8th. This arc concludes with Kaname winning the event, recruiting a few more allies who I'll talk about later, and making an enemy of Wang. The final 3 episodes are centered around Kaname forming his own clan and warring with the 8th, eliminating them and becoming the new dominant force in the game. Now, a 3-act story structure can generally be boiled down into the inciting incident which starts the plot in motion in Act 1. Once the story finishes the introductory phase, we start getting the rising actions of Act 2 that make up the bulk of the story. Things happen to keep the audience entertained, and the protagonists have to continue overcoming obstacles while the story builds up to the climax. This is the part that the audience has been waiting for. In the context of something like an action story, this could be the big confrontation with the villain. It's when the story pays off all the tension it introduced at the beginning of the story and has been reinforcing throughout the second act. This comes right at the transition point between Acts 2 and 3. Act 3 has the falling action, where the intensity lowers and the aftermath of the climax can be witnessed as it leads into the conclusion. That is a standard 3-act story structure, and it's not what Darwin's game does, though it likes to pretend otherwise. Darwin's game has a pretty standard first act, transitions into a second act which is its own complete story arc, and then instead of a typical third act, it shoots the intensity back up to basically speedrun up to an entirely new climax just a few episodes after the previous climax from that mini arc. It feels like the entire season has been building up to the climax of the mini-arc, which came in episode 7 into episode 8. Everything had been consistently building up, and this was the point of the highest tension in the show so far, followed by a natural falling action. When we get the actual climax of the season in episode 10 into episode 11, it feels like it's trying to pay off on buildup that had already reached a conclusion. It takes away from the impact and excitement that it would have otherwise had. You already got the catharsis of having that setup amount to something, and you can't just double dip. It doesn't work. Now look, it's normal for a series to have multiple climaxes over the course of its runtime, but each one needs to have its own dedicated rising actions to back it up so that each one can serve a unique purpose in the story as a whole. That's why most TV series, both anime and Western, will have a structure where they tackle one major arc per season. It allows for each story arc to get the structural care they need, and the gap between seasons serves as a natural breakpoint and allows for the audience to basically reset so they can prepare for the kickoff of the next arc. Darwin's game tried to double dip, and the entire season feels disjointed as a result. They tried to act like the two climaxes could ride the same setup just because they share an antagonist, but it just doesn't work that way. Now, this ties back into my earlier point. I am 100% convinced that most of the fault lies with the executives. I'm willing to bet that they told the creators that the first season had to go from the start to the destruction of the 8th, and quite frankly, I think that's too much story to properly fit into 11 episodes. And honestly, I'm not sure what the creatives could have done here. When you're forced to put a lot of plot into not a lot of runtime, you're gonna have to cut some things and rush other things in order to get the vital stuff in at all. Of course, pacing and structure are gonna be utterly fucked when that happens. I feel like plot-wise, the first season of Darwin's game should have been covered in 2 seasons. The point where Kaname wins the event at the end of episode 8 would have been a great point to close off the season. Having a full season of runtime to develop that arc would have helped a lot, and I feel like every element of the plot and characters could have been more fleshed out as a result. And the last 3 episodes absolutely would have worked as its own season. And the fact that what was basically an entire story arc was condensed into a fucking hour of runtime really just made it awful on a structural level. An entire season dedicated to the formation and rise of Kaname's clan, concluding with a decisive battle against the 8th, would have been phenomenal. Genuinely, I believe that 90% of the pacing issues that Darwin's game has would have been solved by simply giving the creatives more room to breathe. The next big issue is with how they handled the ensemble cast, and honestly, I feel like the whole too much plot and not enough time thing is at fault here as well. Aside from our protagonist Kaname, we have Shuka, the passionate but kinda crazy woman, Rain, who is a weak combatant but is highly intelligent and can semi-reliably calculate what's going to happen in the next minute or so, Ryuji, who's the stoic and gruff one, and lastly there's Sui, the timid and caring pacifist who shares her body with the spirit of her dead twin brother Sota, who is highly aggressive and unempathetic. This is our main cast. There are other characters kind of orbiting them, but this is the crew right here. They have staggered introductions like you might expect to see in a long-running shonen, though each one gets at most a single episode of breathing room. Now here's the thing, I actually do like these characters, and I think they all have a lot of potential in terms of individual character arcs and as contributors to the series as a whole. But they had all their introductions crammed into the first 6 episodes, after which the story basically abandons most of its efforts in terms of character development in favor of a focus on the rest of the plot. As a result, we really only get a surface level look at most of these characters. In fact, the only character to show any kind of serious character development is our protagonist Kaname. This comes with the fact that he goes almost the entire season of a fucking death game anime without killing anyone on principle, sparing the lives of people who would arguably have made more sense to kill. But when one of his school friends who isn't playing the game is kidnapped, tortured, and killed by Wang, he snaps and without any hesitation starts killing people with cold calculation and without remorse. He basically had a fundamental shift in his core values as a response to extreme emotional trauma. This was a genuinely good character moment, which makes it all the more disappointing that none of the other characters got even close to that level of care. Sure, we got a tiny bit of backstory for each of them, enough to understand their motivations as far as why they play the game, but we never really take a look at what's going on underneath the hood. And really, it's just another case of too much stuff they needed to add in a relatively short runtime. Again, most of the big character stuff happened in the first 6 episodes, after which most of the actual character stuff goes towards Kaname, with the series as a whole shifts more towards a plot focus. I understand that the source material had this ensemble cast, so it's not like the anime could just ditch it. But let's imagine a hypothetical world where they had a bit more liberty to change things up. As is, there's simply not enough space to properly expand on a primary cast of 5 characters, or 6 if you count Sui and Sota as separate characters. And that's not to mention that there's a fair amount of supporting characters who need at least a little attention so they can serve their role in the plot. You can't really leave them out if you want to keep the same basic plot, and furthermore, some of them were clearly setting up future story arcs, so they need to stick around. So my solution would be to turn some of the ensemble cast from primary members into purely supporting roles. In fact, I'd want to focus on 3 characters: Kaname, Shuka, and Rain. These are the first 3 important characters we meet, and throughout the season they have more impact on the story as a whole than anyone else. In fact, I'd say that Kaname and Rain are the driving force of that mini arc in the middle of the season. The other cast members can still make their appearances, but let's not pretend they're vital for the time being. Let them serve more as elements to the world than people we're actually following. This will give more time for developing our new primary cast not only as individuals but in their group dynamic. The show gives a pretty solid amount of time to having Kaname interact with both Shuka and Rain on a one-to-one level and establishes a pre-existing relationship between Shuka and Rain due to the latter's status as an information broker. As a result of this genuinely good character work, I feel like these 3 have the best dynamic of any characters in the season. With time, they could certainly introduce more characters into that group, but they need to put in the legwork to make their friendship believable. And this goes back to my point that there's honestly just too much plot to properly work into 11 episodes while also putting proper care into the characters. I mean, just look at Ryuji. He starts out as an enemy in the free-for-all. He's an asshole, and the only reason he didn't outright murder a defenseless Kaname was to basically torment him. They eventually form an alliance out of shared interest both in survival and combating Wang, at which point he basically becomes a different character. He's no longer malicious and instead just kind of becomes no-nonsense. Now, that transition can work, but you need to actually justify it, you know? The alliance makes sense, and I can definitely believe that Ryuji could become more sympathetic, but I need to have a fucking reason for that shift if I'm gonna buy it. So keep him as a background character who's allying with the group out of mutual interest for now, and transition him into a main cast member once you have enough room to let him breathe. A show that I think handled its main cast well was One Piece. I've watched the first 25 episodes or so, and no, I don't plan on making a video about it, but while the show is often criticized for its use of filler episodes that kinda fuck with the pacing, and the fact that the overarching plot is a bit slow to move forward, one thing it does very right is how it builds up the main cast from just one stretchy boy into a proper ensemble cast. Each new member is given their own small but dedicated introductory story arc. This allows us to explore their personality, their motivations, their values, and allows them to form proper relationships with the rest of the cast so none of them ever feel vestigial. They are a very believable group of comrades precisely because of the surprisingly meticulous setup that went into it. Contrast that with Darwin's game when you get one real character in Kaname and a bunch of shallow one-notes hanging off to the side. Every single one of these characters does have very real potential, but it takes work to realize it, and the fact that Darwin's game just doesn't do that really hurts the overall product in my opinion. The last major issue I have is less serious than the others. In fact, if everything else was solid, I could pretty easily just ignore it. But alongside the other flaws, it kinda just compounds the issue. And that issue is the world building, at least in relation to the game itself. See, the basic premise is pretty simple. Win battles to earn points. Use points either for in-game rewards or for cash. Everyone gets a random superpower that can be freely used. Alright, cool. My issue comes with the fact that they seem to love adding in features as one-off plot devices and just generally refusing to explain the nuances of the game. The player search function is introduced to add tension in the first episode as Kaname's opponent is basically able to find his hiding spots. Never used again. A player ranking system is mentioned as a means of loosely power scaling the different characters. We never even get to see what the different ranks are. So we know that Shuka is an A-rank solo player. Through context, we know that's pretty good. But how good exactly? Are there higher letter ranks to achieve? How does rank advancement even work? How does the rank of your opponents affect your own rank as you win fights? We know that Kaname has been performing well, so how is his rank improved? Is there even a point to ranking up aside from putting a target on your back? Aside from the rank requirement to start a clan, it doesn't appear that they actually do anything. It may seem like I'm harping on about this one thing too much, but I feel it's a symptom of a larger issue. I'm not even sure that the writers themselves had a solid idea of how the game really works. In my opinion, if you're crafting a narrative with some sort of crazy gimmick, you should know all the important things about that gimmick before you start writing, especially if it's going to impact the plot at some point. Then you can craft the story so that these things appear naturally and can be explained to the audience either explicitly or through context clues. If there's going to be a feature that massively affects the plot at hand, it would make sense to introduce it before it becomes relevant, because when it does become relevant, it won't feel like it came out of nowhere. Repeated use is a fundamental tenet of world building, and it's shocking how many writers fail at it. And once you're done with that thing, you can't just forget about it. When you introduce a core system into your world, it is stuck as a part of that world until something in-universe removes or nullifies it. Even if it never serves a significant purpose to the plot again, it needs to be acknowledged as a thing. Like the player search function. That seems like an incredibly impactful thing to the overall ecosystem, and it's explained that it's disabled for the duration of that mini-arc in the middle of the season. Okay, all good. But after that arc ends, it's presumably re-enabled, and yet there are multiple instances where characters are manually searching for one another rather than using the fucking search function that's built into the game. Maybe the manga explains this, but the anime sure as hell doesn't. It just shows a general lack of forethought, and again, if everything else was done well, this would be a mild complaint that could be overlooked. But alongside the other flaws, it just makes the series as a whole feel kind of sloppy. And that's kind of what my takeaway is when I look at Darwin's game through an analytical lens. It's just kind of sloppy. Sure, it's likely due to tiny-dicked business executives making unreasonable demands of the writing staff, but that doesn't change the fact that it is very sloppy. So given that I spent the last 15 minutes or so basically shit-talking Darwin's game, and I admittedly have been pretty harsh, you're probably thinking that the title is a lie. But that's where you'd be wrong. Despite the very real flaws the series has, I still fucking loved my time with the show. So how exactly does that make any sense? Well, it all boils down to one overarching concept: fun factor. Now, fun factor is a term that people love to throw around as a means of basically dismissing legitimate criticism, but it is a very real thing. The amount of fun you're having when consuming a piece of media acts as a sort of multiplier as far as how the flaws will affect your own personal enjoyment. Look at Michael Bay's Transformers. These movies were utter dog shit, but the explosions and giant robots fighting are cool and exciting. That's why these movies grossed nearly $5 billion at the box office despite being universally acknowledged as shit. And the thing about Darwin's game is that while it does a lot wrong, it also does a couple of things very right, and those things all contribute to how goddamn fun the show is. First, there's the characters. Now, I know I was critical earlier, but I have to say one thing. The characters aren't actually bad. In fact, I think they're pretty good, it's just that they're underdeveloped. The characters all make sense, they're all pretty consistent in their personalities except for Ryuji like I mentioned earlier, and I actually really love their designs. Each character is visually distinct and has an appearance that really sells their overall vibe. Ryuji, while fairly boring, is large and imposing with an outfit that really fits his overly edgy personality. Sui and Sota are really neat because they inhabit the same tiny girl body, but they make subtle changes to their appearance and facial expression to distinguish who's at the forefront, such as how Sui will typically have her hair covering one eye with a very passive and timid expression, while Sota will have both eyes exposed with a more manic expression. Even though they're still the same core design, it's clear at a glance who is being spoken to, which is neat since they're explicit foils of one another. Or Shuka, who's my favorite character by a mile. She's got that Lolita cupcake dress going on, and the chains she uses as weapons really complement it well. Also, I do kind of have a thing for the insane alternative girl style of character design, so there's a bit of that informing my opinion. The thing about character design is that oftentimes the most creative things you'll find are in the really fantastical settings because they don't need to follow any type of conventional logic to make sense. But while Darwin's game is absolutely fantastical in nature, it's still set in the real world, and the consequences of the game are for the most part confined to the participants, though there are a few exceptions. These characters manage to stay memorable and interesting despite the fact that they're relatively grounded. Like, if you ran someone who looks like this in real life, it might stand out a bit, but it's not so weird as to be unnatural. So I find it really impressive that these characters all look so damn good from a design perspective. And furthermore, let me reiterate what I said earlier. These characters aren't bad, just underdeveloped. My main issue with them is that we never get a serious look underneath the surface. But fortunately for us, the surface level that we do see is pretty damn good. The characters all have very distinct personalities that mesh really well with their respective abilities. Shuka's manic, unhinged aggression really complements her ability to control her chains and make them almost like deadly cobras. Rain's non-confrontational attitude and high intelligence works well with her ability to temporarily calculate a likely future based on thousands of variables. Our protagonist Kaname spends the season getting by mainly on the back of his ingenuity and quick thinking, which just so happens to be augmented by his ability to recreate weapons at will. While the characters haven't gotten the level of depth and exploration that I'd like to see, the baseline level of intrigue within each of these characters is more than enough to create fun and interesting moment-to-moment interactions. And while they don't have the deep interpersonal bonds that can truly make an ensemble cast shine, their unique and sometimes contrasting personalities each add something to the group dynamic, making it feel very natural as you're watching the show. And the characters are all mostly written in such a way that they're allowed to be entertaining from the moment they're introduced. We don't really have anything like a full-on kudera type of character where their entire payoff is the slow build-up into an emotional epiphany. The only exception is arguably Ryuji, though he's actually humanized very quickly with a short explanation as to why he plays the game. But I think my point stands. While these characters have so much unrealized potential, they're still interesting enough as is to be fun and engaging until we get to that point. The next reason I love this show so goddamn much is the motherfucking fight scenes. In a supernatural death game, you've got to imagine there's going to be some flashy fight scenes, and oh man, they do not disappoint. The animation in the show as a whole is, I'd say, largely okay. Nothing particularly bad about it, but nothing particularly great about it either. But they definitely step it up in the fight scenes, which, let's be fair here, those are the biggest draw for a show like this. Now here's the thing, I don't think Darwin's Game was a particularly high budget production, so on a technical level it's not going to be the absolute best thing you've ever seen. There are definitely points where you can see that they were conserving their funds with things like glorified still frames where only the mouth and clothing are moving as the character delivers a line of dialogue. That stuff does happen, but what it lacks in technical prowess, it more than makes up for in a general sense of style and flair. When I talk about visuals in a video game, I always say that style and design are much more important than graphical fidelity. You could have the most photorealistic game in history, but in my opinion that'll always be miles behind something like Mark of the Ninja or Grease. I think the same principle applies to anime as well. Technical limitations can be worked around, and I think Darwin's Game does a great job of that. The use of colors is pretty neat, with many important elements in fight scenes highlighted purely due to the contrast with the background. I noticed that a contrast of red clothing or blood with the blue overtones of the city at night was a common theme in many of the scenes, and it just looks fucking good. And the lighting and shadows is, in my opinion, extremely well done. I'm not super knowledgeable about art and animation in general, so it's very hard for me to properly articulate my thoughts here. But many of the fight scenes like to play around with the lighting, sometimes explicitly, such as the Kaname and Shuka fight scene where Kaname causes a blackout in order to gain the upper hand. And sometimes it's more of just a stylistic flair, such as the fight scene that takes place on top of two moving vehicles where the street lights are constantly whizzing by. And of course, I can't talk about the visuals without talking about the neat use of underlighting, which is what you call it when an element is given a glowing effect. Many sigils will glow when activated, highlighting the unnatural essence of the game. A lot of characters will have eyes that glow when they fight, which combines with the neat lighting effects. And even little things like the glow of an indoor light or the glint of a sword all add to the overall atmosphere the show is trying to cultivate. The fights just straight up look good. But more important than the fights just looking cool, I think they're very well designed and choreographed. One of my biggest pet peeves about a lot of shows and movies, but particularly superhero movies, is that I feel like the special abilities are woefully underutilized in the art of fight scenes. More often than not, superpowers end up being boiled down to yet another thing to hit the other guy with. When a fight scene just ends up being two people hitting each other in flashy ways, it may be impressive, but it's ultimately nothing we haven't seen before. I love seeing the interesting ways you could potentially utilize a special ability that may not be immediately obvious. If someone used a superpower for long enough, they'd eventually figure out some neat things to do with it, and I feel like Darwin's Game actually thought of that. One thing I noticed is that Kaname almost never wins by straight up overpowering someone else. It always comes down to ingenuity and quick thinking. He sets up a trap to distract Shuka during his fight with her. He pickpockets an opponent's phone after distracting him with a stun gun mid-combat in order to force a surrender. I'm not going to list every single cool fight trick he does because honestly that would just ruin it for you. But the thing about Darwin's Game is that fights almost never end in a conventional way. The stronger person doesn't just win by default. It's always some clever thing that one person does that beats the other. In fact, most of the time when one party blindly charges in trying to brute force things, they are quickly and decisively put in their place. And that's not to say it's lacking in flashy action, there's plenty of that. But you never really know what's gonna happen, unlike an MCU movie where you just know they're gonna hit and or zap each other until one side comes out on top. Above all else, the fight scenes in Darwin's Game are fantastic, and I would say that they alone are worth picking up the show for. And lastly, I'll say that the story itself, while I maintain that the plot is extremely rushed, is intriguing. There's enough there that you're left wanting to know what comes next by the time the season ends. Furthermore, I think it does a great job of keeping the viewer engaged with both the immediate threat and the overarching narrative of the story. See, Wang is definitely the season 1 antagonist, but he's not the big bad. In fact, he has no direct connection to the real villain whatsoever, the Game Master, the person who created Darwin's Game, who is still shrouded in mystery at this point. While the driving force in the minute-to-minute activities is the growing threat of Wang and the 8th, it's made clear that pretty much every significant allied character has some sort of beef with the Game Master, and some of them even entered the game specifically so they could eventually put a bullet in him. So that's something that is very clearly going to motivate everyone moving forward. And of course, since many people were motivated by the loss of a loved one to the game, if we get to explore these characters further like we should, that'll only serve to build the tension and make us want to see that final confrontation. And shit, they even planted the seed of that confrontation in the single conversation we get from the Game Master. In a phone call after Kaname wins the event in that weird mid-season arc, the Game Master says that there are two ways to leave the game. Either you complete the game, or you kill the Game Master, at which point the game just ends. That alone makes me very curious, like what the fuck is going on? And the overall intrigue is the main reason that I'm 100% going to be reading the manga. Usually an adaptation will not make me immediately want to engage with the source material. Typically I need a bit of breathing room before I revisit the same story in a different form. But not here. I want to continue this fucking story because shit's about to go down and I want to know what happens, goddammit. The story certainly isn't without flaws, but fuck me if I'm not completely hooked. So what is my overall takeaway? And welcome back to those of you who only wanted a spoiler-free overview. Darwin's Game is a very flawed show. The pacing is incredibly rushed, there are too many characters introduced in too short a time, leaving them all underdeveloped, and the world building as a whole is just kind of unrefined. But despite that, what we get is fun and exciting. The characters, while they certainly need a bit of TLC, are weird and fun enough to carry things for the time being. The plot, while very poorly paced, does consistently give our cast a goal that we want them to succeed at and pits them against a villain who we want to see go down. It could be done better, but it definitely could be done worse. The world building does at times feel like the writers themselves don't know what's going on as far as the finer details, but the overarching mystique of the titular Darwin's Game left me consistently wanting more, and as a result, I will be reading the manga on my own time. On top of all the positives and negatives I just discussed are some absolutely phenomenal fight scenes. Very pretty, stylish as hell, and most importantly of all, extremely clever and well choreographed. In my opinion, the fight scenes alone make the show worth a watch. So in conclusion, even though a significant portion of this video was spent complaining about Darwin's Game, I wholeheartedly recommend it. Look, it's got more than its fair share of issues, but that doesn't change the fact that I had a damn good time with it, and I think you will too. It's great fun, and every issue I did have with it could potentially be fixed if the series continues. Just fucking watch it. So early in the video, I said I wanted feedback. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that anime reviews are a new thing I'm experimenting with, and I'm trying to figure out how exactly I want to go about them because I quite frankly don't know as much about anime as I do about video games and text-based media such as visual novels. I think the type of thing I did for Demon Slayer, where I went in 3-episode chunks writing down my thoughts as I go, worked pretty well. However, I also think that this video style of watching an entire season and then honing in on a few core topics in a bit more depth is also something I can handle well enough. At the moment, I'm thinking that the retrospective style would be good for series that don't necessarily have a fast-moving plot for me to analyze moment by moment, so slice of life or sitcom style shows. Whereas I can keep the script as I go method for things like shonen, drama, or horror. But do let me know what you think, especially the weebs in the audience who do understand anime more than me. I want to make the best videos possible and I could use your input. And of course, let me know what other series I should check out for the channel. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially my God tier supporters Bulk Squat Thrust, Drago, Fatima, and Michael Rotolo. Consider joining them for cool perks such as your name in videos and early access to future content by joining Patreon linked below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe because it genuinely does help me in the algorithm. Follow me on Twitter at @adstweets and join the Discord server for some good times. Once again, thank you all for watching and I'll see you next time. Play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more.